So happy Tuesday. Well, I look different today, don't I? Nobody gets that joke. So this is an attendance register. Everybody assign. And these are copies of last lecture's notes. For anybody that missed them. Copies of last lecture's notes, if you missed them. Yeah. So I'm filling in for Adeline today, just for today. Yeah, she invited me to give this lecture because she knows how amazing and outstanding it is. So for anybody that missed it last week, we're talking about three things: unit testing, integration testing, in the context of a real-world example. Right, so we're mixing all three of those things. And it's not very often that you're going to get to see like real-world programs that are fully functional and do something. Right, so we gave an introduction to unit testing and integration testing, the theory, last time. And we started to talk about this example. Now what we're doing, what this program does, is it converts an Excel file to XML format. That's what the program does. And we're going to look at the program that does that today. Sound exciting? Any questions before we start? I like how everybody got on one side. I've never seen that before. You're the outlier. You're the maverick. So this is what the spreadsheet looks like, right? It has different columns and different rows. The first row is the paper ID, the paper title, abstract, keywords, starting page, page range, first author, first name, first author, surname, and so on. So we're talking about a spreadsheet with a list of publications in it, or the metadata of all the publications, not the actual publications themselves, all the data about them. We want to take this spreadsheet in Excel format and convert it to XML format. That's the. You can imagine that being a software engineering tool project. That could definitely be a project for this class. No pun intended. So let's look at the program that actually does that. So it's called CSV to XML. Right, we started to look at it last time. We want to continue this time. And we'll start with the main method. Right? So this is the main method of CSV to XML. It can also be viewed as a demonstration of integration testing. Does anybody remember what integration testing is?
It's in your class you have a method, but you test methods from your class. You call them.
That's unit testing.
Oh, yeah.
That's a textbook definition of it. Is it Yenis or something?
Yes, yeah.
Yenis. That's a very good answer for unit testing.
Total fail.
Not total. No, you would get some points. If that was a test question or something, you would get some points. It's when you test more than one class together. So 2 or more. Right? Hey, he had the courage to answer the question. Anyway, so we're testing CSV to XML, and we're also testing 2 other classes. One's called publication and one's called author. Right, so let's have a look at what this program does and what it looks like. By the way, I'm using NetBeans, if anybody else is using NetBeans. Anybody else here use NetBeans? No. What do you use? Eclipse? Eclipse. Okay. I tried Eclipse, but I didn't get the good feelings from it right away. So I instantiate a new CSV to XML object, right? And then I open the input file. By the way, what is the pre-processing step before I open the input file? Is there a pre-processing step? Does anybody remember that from last time?
Check if the file exists.
That's a good thing to always check and see if the file exists. But there's something even before that.
Have to convert it to an open source format.
That's right. So we save it in CSV format, not Excel format, right? So we take the Excel file, we save it in CSV format, comma separated values, which is a text file, right? Because Excel is closed and text format is open. So actually we're reading it now. We've changed the problem. We're reading now a CSV file instead of an Excel file. And then we're converting that to XML. So it's sort of a two conversion process actually. Right. So the first method is called open input file. So that's pretty exciting, isn't it? This opens the input CSV file. And there's still some notes in here from back in the time when I started to write the program and I didn't have my library that I imported. I didn't import this nice library at first called OpenCSV-2.3 jar. So there are still some leftover notes. And at the time, before I imported that library, I was actually looking up ways to remove white space in case you get white space. Right? If somebody gives you a file name and it has white space either before the name or after the name, you have to remove it. Right? So I was looking up things like that. And that's what that note is. The white space characters. Right, and I made a link to where I was looking up the white space characters. So here we just call an accessor method called setInputFile. So this is the old things that I was trying to remove the white space before I started using the OpenCSV. So that is setInputFile. Does anybody know what set input? What's that? That's an example of what kind of method that is. This is a very good question for a software engineering module. So that's a kind of method. It belongs to a special class of methods that are really important. Does anybody know what that class or kind of method is? Accessor method. What's your name? Stephen. Excellent, Stephen. Excellent. That's so good that you know that. That's something that everybody needs to know. So you'll notice in this program, we're always using accessor methods. Always set and get methods, right? To set local variables, member variables, right? We're always using those. And in each of the methods, there's this little test flag that I can set to true if I'm debugging or trying to test the program to see if it's actually working, right? And then I try to create a new CSV reader object based on the input file. And if there's no file, right, it throws an exception. Otherwise, it returns true, right, and it succeeds in opening the CSV file. Right? So that's not very exciting, right? So let's go back to the main method. That's the program, by the way. It's very elegant, right? Open input file, read publications, close input file. Right? Open output file, write to XML, and then close the output files. So the only complicated method is read publications. Well, I don't know if you want to call it complicated. The only non-trivial method is called read publications. So let's look at it. So this reads basically, right, we have a table and it goes through the table one row at a time and reads in the data. I imagine this might be part of your assignment in this class too, right, to read in some data from a file. Is that part of the assignment? Is it in CSV format, the data? Which format is it in? You have to define your own. Okay, so you could define the CSV format as your own.
It's easier to just add some commas maybe when you use them.
Yeah, that's what this is.
Yeah,
it's
commas
just,
maybe, yeah.
So you could actually use this for your assignment, right? You can see how to get it to work. Right? This is very, very common processing, file input and output processing. So that's another reason why it's such an interesting example. So the local testing flag. The way the CSV reader works is that it reads in one line at a time from the CSV file. So it just reads in one line and it stores it in an array of strings. So that's what a string array looks like. That means each entry in the array is a string. That's what that means. And then, that's fun. This is one of the fun things about Java. It has an integer object, which is kind of, if you're a second-year student, that's kind of funky. For me, I think it's great. But for a second-year student, it might be like an integer object, because you're used to integer data types, are you? Like int 1 or whatever, x. That's an integer object. And I use that to convert a string to a number. Like if we read in a 1 from a text file, it's a character, it's a string. And we use the integer object to convert that string or a character to an integer data type. Right? An ASCII character of 1 to an integer data type of 1, for example. And we'll see that in action. This is just some debugging things. I always like to put in some debugging. This really should have like an if test equals true, then output this information. And I recommend this for everybody for the rest of their life. This is a convention that I use always in all of my software. And I think it's a great, great convention. So if I'm printing out anything, the printout statement always starts with the name of the class doing the printing and then the name of the method that the printing is called from. Right? So I know if the program were to crash, of course it's not going to crash, but if it were to crash, I would know exactly where, right? Which class and which method. I was really surprised to find out that students didn't use this already back in the day when I was teaching this. I have a method called skip line, so it starts with skip line. Anybody know what this is for?
Something to do when you read an integer is like something to do with read
Did you skip new line characters? Any other guesses? Where's the attendance register? Hiding. Everybody sign it. Any other guesses about the skip line, why that's there? It's because the first line of the Excel file is just that it's not really data. Remember? It says the word abstract, keywords, paper ID. It's the column headers. So that's not data that I want to read and store as a record. I'm not converting that first line. So I have a method called skip line. And then we try to read in the data, read the CSV records from the file using the scanner object. So this is a complicated line. I don't usually like to write complicated lines like this, but anyways, it's essentially a loop that processes each line one at a time until we get to the end of the file, right? So there's read one line, that's called read next line. Store it in the in the string array. There it is, next line, right? And only do that if you have something being returned by read next, right? It's going to stop if read next returns null, and read next returns null if it's at the end of the file, or if the file is empty, right? Or something like that, it just has nothing in it. So now the row is stored in this next line string array. So we have to get the information out of the string array and then store it somewhere. Right. So we instantiate a new publication, right? Because each line in the Excel file corresponds to one publication. Right? So for each line, we instantiate a publication object. Right? And the publication object stores all the information about one publication. Right? An ID, a title, abstract keywords, start page, and page range. So here's the string. Here's the string array. So in the new publication object, the first thing is the ID, right? And that's the string array, and that's the entry in the string array that contains the ID. Right? That's very easy to understand, isn't it? So the ID comes first. We can verify that by looking at the Excel file if we want. The next thing that comes is the paper title. So I have set the paper title. So these are all accessor methods again. Set the abstract. Set the keywords. And then the next thing after keywords is the starting page. So if all of these publications appear in a book, they all have a start page, and the first one is 529. So this reads in the start page as a string, and then it uses the integer object, the built-in integer object in Java, to convert it. Well, it stores it as an integer object first, and then it converts it to an actual integer data type. That's what those two lines do. Does that make sense to everybody, I hope? We're converting a string to an integer object, a string data type to an integer object there. And then we set the page range. Does anybody notice anything kind of interesting about these lines? Something that you don't usually see that makes the world a much better place? The formatting is aligned. It's unusual. So the formatting highlights the redundancy. But the way we're accessing the array is kind of unusual, isn't it? Most beginner-level programmers, average novice newbies, would just put in a 0 here, a 1 here, a 2 here, a 3 here, and a 4 here, and then a 5 here, rather than symbolic constants. Right? That's what most newbies, average, kind of not very expert developers would do, right? They would just put the numbers in there. Isn't it true? Any problems with that?
Doesn't really make sense.
It makes it much more difficult to read. You don't know what the numbers are. Anybody know what they're called? When you just said it. I think you just said it. Magic numbers. How did you know that? Well done. Neil Harmon said that? Awesome. Way to go, Neil. I need to pat him on the back. Yes, those are called magic numbers. Anytime you see a number in there, it's a magic number because you don't know what it is. Imagine you see 2 6s, like you see a 6 here and a 6 in a different method. Are they both the same 6? We don't know. One could be like a 6-pack of beer, and one could be a 6 muffins. If we want to change the 6 muffins, that doesn't. Maybe we want to change the 6-pack of beer. We just don't know, right? It's a total mystery. So we get rid of the magic numbers. Another advantage of this is, if any of these columns changes, right? Maybe the format changes. I can just simply change the number here, and I can change my columns accordingly very easily. So if the columns change their positions, it's easy to change the code. Right? So that's the read. That's the start of the read publications, and then the next bit is read authors. Now, read authors is in its own method because it's a little bit kind of, well, it's not really tricky, but it would make this method too long if it was stuck inside here. And the other sort of non-trivial aspect about the authors is we don't know how many there are in advance. There could be 1 author, there could be 2 or 3, or I mean there could be 100. It's not very common, but some publications have 100, 150 authors. It's not very common, but we don't know in advance how many authors there are going to be. So we take that out. And we look at the read authors method. Right, so read authors, it has a reference to the next line, and it has the current publication that we're adding the authors to. Right? And it's been Java docked, so it's pretty clear. The current record from the CSV file and the current publication the authors wrote. We have our local testing flag. We have the integer object again. We don't know how many authors there are. So the first thing we do is we compute the number of authors. This is a little bit difficult to follow. It's possible to follow with symbolic constants. But without these symbolic constants here, you would not be able to follow this. Right? So we're taking the length of the whole row, and we're subtracting off the page range from that whole length. So imagine the whole length, right? That's the beginning and that's the end. We're subtracting off the bit in the beginning up to the page range. So we're subtracting off this bit in the beginning, all the fields up to the page range. And then the rest of the information is authors. But there are 3 columns for each author. The surname, the first name, and the affiliation. So we divide by 3. Take the whole length, subtract off the beginning, divide the remainder by 3. And we get the number of authors. So that's what this line is doing. Entries per author which is 3 in this case. So if we're testing, then we compute the number of authors, and then we read in an author list, right? For each author, create a new author object where we store the author information, and that's what this is. So here's an author. It has a first name, last name, and affiliation. Right? We set the first name, and this is a kind of funky way of finding out where the first name is in the array. Right? That's being computed each time. So it's the authors plus the first name, and then the entries times I for the first author. So I is 0 in the first instance, right? So the first author is just the author index plus the first name, the author's index plus the last name, and then the author's index plus the affiliation. And when in the next loop, I is 1, right? So to get the next 3, we have to multiply that 1 by 3 to jump to the next 3 in the for loop. That's what that multiplication is, I times entries per author. And if I was using magic numbers in there, you'd have no chance of knowing what was going on there. If I just had like numbers like 5, 3, and 2 in there, and then 5, 3, and 3, and then 5, 3, and 4, you just have no idea what was going on there. Well, you'd have some idea because of the names, set first name, set last name, and set affiliation, but you wouldn't really understand how they were being computed. And if we have an empty author, if for some reason there's an empty author, we skip it, right? And then we add the authors to the publication. Right? So that's the idea for read authors. And then we're going to read publications. Right, so we have our loop. We have our, for each publication, then we have our read authors. And then we get the list of publications. So we started a list of publications and we added to the list. So there's a list of publication objects and we're just adding it to the list. So get publications, there's a list down there, right there, a list of publications, and we're just adding it to the list. Any questions about that? So you can use something like this in your project. Let me see if there's anything else in there. And then there are lots of exceptions, right? If something goes, if there's an IO exception, right? We get interrupted in the middle of reading. An element, no such element exception, and format exception. Right? And let's see what else we have. We close our input file, right? I even have a comment, don't forget to close your input file. Then we open an output file, which is the XML file, and we write to XML. There are 2 versions. One is write all of the information to one XML file, and then another one is take each entry and put it in its own XML file. There are 2. Right. And if we go back here, this is all of them together, and this is the individual once. And the file name we're using is the paper ID in this case. So write to XML, what does that look like? So output the list of publications in XML format to a single file. Later on, there was a change request to write each publication in its own XML file. So we added a method to do that. And I left this one just in case the client changed their mind again and said, oh no, actually I changed my mind again. I want to go back to the single file. And so we have our testing flag. We open the output file. And I did buy a book on XML just to make sure that I was following the standard XML formats, all of the standards. So all XML files have this as their first line. It's a standard file format, right? Then I start outputting each of the publications, right? So the publications start with this tag called publication list, right? Has anybody seen XML before? Yeah. It's very similar to HTML. And we have a for loop for each publication in the list. Get the publication and then write it to the XML file, right? So there's a publication object and it has a method called write to XML. And that's what it looks like when you write a single publication to XML format. So it has a begin publication tag, the end publication, and then the paper ID, the title, the abstract, the keywords, the year, the type, and so on. And then there's another for loop for each author in the author's list. Print out the author. So that's in its own method too, called, guess what, write to XML. And that's what it looks like when you output a single author to the same XML file. Right? You have a begin author tag, the first name, the surname, the affiliation, and the last, well, the end author tag. Right? And then we return true. So author is pretty simple. So output each publication, end the list, catch the exceptions, and then return true. So very, very, very simple output, very easy. And the unique one is very, very similar, right? So write to unique file, output the publications, where each publication is stored in its own file. So here, we cycle through the publications again, and then we call a method called write to unique XML file in the publications class, in the publication class, right? So we output this in its own file, right? Here we're opening the file and closing the file. Each time, right? So we're opening a new file and closing the file every time. And then author, right? There's a for loop for author. And actually this one is the same. So we actually didn't have to write any new method for the author because it's exactly the same method. which is very convenient, isn't it? That's a good example of code reuse. Now that's the integration testing. That's basically, those are the most interesting methods from the CSV to XML example. So you can get a copy of this on Blackboard, right, or on my webpage. And to wrap things up, this was an example of integration testing. Well, what about the unit testing bits? Well, if we look at the publication class, it has, surprise, surprise, a main method. So this is the method we can use for testing, unit testing the publication object or class. It's an example of unit testing. Adding authors is also a good example of integration testing for the publication plus author combination, right? So if imagine you're working on a project and each of you is responsible for an object or a class to write it, and you have to demonstrate to your other team members that it's working, this is the way to go. This is how you demonstrate. So you don't have arguments about if it's working or not, like does your class really work? You don't have to argue about that anymore, because you have a unit test with your class that calls each method in the class with invalid and valid input, right? So begin the unit test. We create a new publication, and then we just start adding artificial data to the publication. That's all artificial data. We test the author class. We add artificial data to the author class or an author object. We print the publication to make sure the printing is working. We write it to an XML file, right, to make sure that that's working. And we open the output file, write to a unique XML file, close the output file, and so on. So that's an example of a very trivial unit test right there. But maybe I can convince you that publication, the object, is working, or maybe not. If we were working in a team, would you trust me? Could I do any better than this unit test? Any guesses? Say it again?
JUnit.
Yeah, you could use JUnit. What would you do with JUnit if you use JUnit? How could you improve this?
Testing methods, like assert something, and then make it automatically, make it more
Automated, yeah. Any other things we could do to improve this? Maybe we don't like the complexity of JUnit. Maybe we do. It's good to know about. Any other ideas on how this could be improved? Liam Chalice in my tutorial group. Liam, what do you think? Any ideas on how to improve this unit test? I couldn't quite hear you. Yes, that is correct. You could test with more input data, right? Some artificial Excel file data. Very good answer. Very good answer. Any other thoughts how to improve this? So I didn't do, the truth is I didn't do a very good job with the unit testing here. It's like the most minimal possible unit testing in the world. It's not that great. Any other suggestions how I could improve that? Alistair?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I'd say more method calls, different inputs and that.
More what calls?
More method calls.
More method calls, yep. With what?
Well, different data.
Different data?
Yeah.
Okay.
Actually,
Any special kind of data?
inverse data, I guess.
Incorrect, yes! That's exactly right. So you bombard your methods with invalid input too, to make sure they don't crash and they can handle it. They should just throw an error that says invalid input. So yeah, the more you can do that, the better, right? So that's where it starts to get complicated. Trying to test all the invalid cases, that starts to get very complicated. And then it starts to make sense to think about more complex ways to test the methods, like using maybe JUnit to give these methods lots of invalid input and see if they don't crash. Right. Okay, any questions about that? So you can get a copy of this on Blackboard. If there's some reason it's not there, just let us know, but it should already be there along with the other classes. You can use this as in your programs, right, to import, to read in CSV files and all that stuff. Any questions about that? Comments? Anybody find it interesting to see an actual program that does something? I'm surprised nobody said, "Oh, Bob, you didn't run the program actually." I don't know. I don't think it actually works. So maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. I don't know. Let's try it out. See if it actually works. It's a very fast laptop, as you can see. On a normal laptop, it would be, instantaneous. So it sort of looks like it worked, right? There's some console. There's a lot of debugging information there because I like, because it's sort of work in progress, right? And then we can check the actual files, right? That's the XML file, or one of the XML files. And I actually don't know what Safari does with an XML file. Let's see what the suspense is agonizing. I don't know what Safari does with an XML file. Like I said, I tried to have a really, really fast laptop. Looks like it's okay. I don't know why that is. Don't know why. But we can try opening it with something else. For example, text edit. So that didn't crash. So that's what it looks like, the XML file. So you got your publication list, and then a publication, and then your abstracts, and so on. So it seems to work, but you can download it and test it for yourself and see if it actually works. Any questions or comments? Okay, we'll stop by there. use date.